My name is Kent Vincent, and I'm going to kind of host our time today. I'm Nashville based. If you know us at all at Auxano, we're virtual, so we're all over the place. Greg Gibbs is joining us from Detroit. Greg,
Hey,
good morning. How are you?
I'm good. It's beautiful in Michigan today, so I'm feeling especially chipper.
Well, you sound chipper. And then far out west in the beautiful land of Montana, we have Mike Gammill, who is joining us. Good morning, Mike.
Yeah, good morning, Kent. Good morning, Greg. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. It is also a beautiful day here in Bozeman. We finally cooled down a little bit, so it's a great day.
Well, guys, it's good to have you with us. As we jump in, we're going to cover a lot of content. Want to give you just a couple of, there we go. Want to give you a couple of kind of instructions as we go along. First of all, we're going to talk about generosity today. So be open with new thinking or ideas. We're going to probably press into some things you have not thought about before. And so keep leaning in there. We want you to eliminate distractions of focus. If the phones are on or the dog's out or the doors are open, or the TV's on, shut those down so you can stay with us. We won't be long, but don't want you to miss anything. We're going to use the chat box at the bottom of the screen there. So take a second, drop your name and city and state in the chat box so we know who you are, where you're from. And then we're going to also use that chat box for all of our Q&A. At the end, we're going to follow up on it. So as we go along in our content, if there's anything that you have a question about, man, just take a second, drop it in there, and so we can circle back up toward the end. So, Greg, as we get going, I'm going to go to you first. You talk about this whole idea of Jesus people. Tell us about that.
Well, it's funny. I don't know how old you are, but I remember hearing about the Jesus people back in the day, and maybe you're one of them. Maybe you know of them. But I find myself actually using the term Jesus people these days. I'll say to my wife, is that family? Are they Jesus people? And I'm actually being very intentional about that because I think there's a difference between following Jesus and calling yourself a Christian. And I know the people that are on this call understand and are picking up what I'm putting down. But when I say Jesus people, I mean people that are following Jesus Christ, his ways, his teachings, his attitudes, his postures. And so for me, a part of my life call is to say to folks, hey, are we acting like Jesus people with all the joy and challenge and complexity that may imply, but especially in the category of generosity. So what I say and write about is the fact that Jesus people should be and could be the most giving people in the world because they should be the definition of generosity, the human imitation of the generous God they claim to follow. So kind of my dream for the churches that Kent and Mike and I work with is that not only would your church be able to fuel your mission through people's giving, but that really we would represent Christ in our community, that people would say, oh, that church, oh man, aren't they the people that are super generous? And people hear about your church and say, isn't that the church that gave away a bunch of stuff or helps people when they're in need? Or I just know people from that church are giving and generous people. That's our dream for you. And so that's why we create all this stuff to help you, training and coaching and things like that. So we don't want you to go away empty-handed today because we want to be generous. And so we're going to give you a couple of steps or actions or, like facilitation tools that we use when we're coaching churches because it'll give you a taste, kind of an appetizer for what it's like to engage deeply in this material, because when we're talking about generosity with churches, we're literally talking about shifting a culture, shifting from one thing to another thing. And often it's shifting from talking about money as merely a financial thing or a way to meet the budget or a way to pay the bills and trying to shift the culture to making it just part of who we are, an outgrowth of our faith. Whether the church budget is being met or not, people are continuing to understand what it means to be like a Jesus person. And so, so we're giving you a taster of how we coach churches today, and you'll be able to use it with your team.
Awesome. Well, there's a challenge, and I'll be interested to get feedback from you guys as we go along. So in a recent study, we surveyed 500 of the largest churches in the country. These churches range from anywhere between 1,000 and 20,000 in worship. We asked them a pretty pointed question. What's the biggest financial obstacle that you're facing? And when we asked them that, here were their top three responses: an aging donor base, church debt, and lack of a generosity strategy. Now, what's interesting about this is those are large churches, but as I have worked with churches, and this week I represented Auxano at the Southern Baptist Convention, and I put this on a kind of a flip chart behind me, and had more comments from small churches as well. This is a church issue. So the challenge right now is we do have aging donor bases. A lot of us are carrying church debt, and most of us don't have a generosity strategy, which is what the challenge is, and which is why you're on this webinar today. And so what's the solution? Well, there is a way to disciple a culture of generosity. In fact, Greg has a new book out. He's our author. He's the author among us, but his new book is Creating a Culture of Generosity. And it really is a field guide. It's designed to help you in a very functional and practical way. We talk about 5 ways to building the culture. That's kind of what our content map is going to be for today. But the 5 ways are theology, discipleship, strategy, communication, and integration. And so we want to kind of do a quick dive, unpack a little bit about each of these ways with those 2 action points that you can take away today. So let's go theology. Greg, why don't you lead us into wave 1 around theology?
Yeah, I get so excited about this, and maybe I nerd out a little bit on the theological aspect of it. But for me, you got to start there, because I think there's a lot of assumptions that are made in churches about what we mean when we say generosity or stewardship or giving or sacrifice or whatever it is. Even the word the tithe is a kind of misunderstood and misinterpreted word. And so what we maybe could have presumed about people's knowledge base 50 years ago or even 25 years ago can't be presumed now. So when we come in and work with a church, we first ask the question, wait, before we start doing tactics and methods and small groups and whatever, what do you actually believe? How important is it? Things like that. If you could advance that slide, Kent. What I try to do is just kind of ask people a lot of different things about different categories in theology, whether it's, again, definition of terms, whether it's what the Old Testament or New Testament says, how we interpret that in light of where our church is at. And so it becomes a lively conversation, because I find sometimes even on the senior leadership team, you'll have some folks that may or may not agree. And then there's just a great conversation about coming to a mutual understanding of what are we going to say about what it means to be generous in our Jesus following. And so that's where we start. We always start with kind of the groundwork of theology, and then we start moving into other things that may seem less conceptual and a little bit more tactical or boots on the ground. Buddy, Ken, I'm still seeing your slide on the challenge. I'm not seeing the next slide. Can someone help me with Zoom? I'm not sure what's going on here. Are you all seeing the theology slide?
Is it stuck? It's stuck.
Stuck. All
Yeah,
right.
man. I don't know how to fix that. Hold on.
Ooh, that's the it just went.
Oh,
past.
it did it. It did it.
Okay, it went. That's right. It's good. We'll leave it right there.
Okay.
So,
good.
for instance, these are some of the ways that we interact on this question. So, for instance, if I'm in front of a board, or if I'm in front of senior pastors, or if I'm in front of a stewardship or giving committee, we just want to sit down and take a deep breath and have a discussion. What is our church's view of the criticality of giving in the life of a Christian? For instance, one of the things I want to say to people is, do you think this is a big deal or not? And if you're on this call and you're theologically trained, like probably most of you are, you know that about that sort of funny gap, that it was one of Jesus' favorite topics and one of the preacher's least favorite topics. So I always ask the question, why was Jesus always kind of poking at people in a very gracious way about money? And yet we haven't figured out a way to do that in a way that doesn't feel either heavy-handed or creepy or whatever. And so anyway, to have a discussion with your team about, hey, is this an important part of discipleship? For instance, I have a thesis that it is the most important. You may not agree with me, but I would love to have that discussion with you. Like Billy Graham said, if someone gets the money thing right, every other aspect will start to fall into place. And at least in my experience, I have seen that to be true. And then another way to do it is ask the question, how do we describe the motivation for giving? We all know by now that people are not motivated to give because we're quote unquote behind budget. That doesn't motivate anybody. And yet there's different generations, there's different theological perspectives. Some people are motivated to give out of gratitude. look at what God has done for me. I'm going to give back in gratitude. Or sometimes obedience, like this is what we ought to do. Sometimes the motivation is loyalty. Man, I want to be loyal to Christ and to the church and to, this place where people have poured so much into me and so on. But for me, part of the theology wave, and again, we're talking about 5 waves, part of the theology wave is to say and discuss with your folks, what do we think for a Jesus person ought to be or could be the primary motivation for increased generosity? Because if we start to dive deep in theology, then we have some of the groundwork we need to be able to move ahead to disciple people toward that generosity.
Greg, I love everything about this section with the theology. As I've worked with clients, I've been just reminded that until we remind them to talk about theology, they do push in on some of those things that you mentioned with their churches. They lead with need. They lead with budget. They lead with the idea of obligation. And like you've said, what we know is those things really aren't nearly as motivational as we think they are, particularly in the long run. In the long run, a heavy-handed approach on those things, even a light-handed approach, will decrease your giving over time, even if it meets it in the short run. But in the long run, we're not making disciples. We're not being more like Jesus. And we end up running something just like ends up being that we're just talking about money when we should be talking about discipleship. So I just think it's critical that we start with theology.
Yeah, by the way, Mike, just a little advertisement for some of the content of the book. One of the chapters in the theology wave is the most frequently asked questions we hear as generosity consultants from church leaders across every denomination, every state, every church, whatever. So that's a fun little teaser because it's everything from frequently asked questions about the tithe to whether or not the senior pastor should look at the giving records, and you name it. It's all the hot ones, and they're in that theology wave. But keep going with discipleship because this is very, very important.
Yeah. And that theology section, just that conversation collaboratively in your church will open up a lot of interesting discussions. So enjoy. Discipleship. So second wave is discipleship. You can see the chapter title. Sorry that it locked up earlier. I wasn't aware of that. I had to look at a different screen. I want to really just live in that chapter 15, 16 around pathway. One of the big game changers I've experienced as I've worked with churches is making the giving journey visual. And every church has a different way to do that. Here's an example of 3 of them. You can see the one in the blue. They created 5 levels, and they're, am I a pre-giver, a periodic giver, proactive giver, percentage giver, partner giver? You're helping folks. You're creating a pathway that they can find themselves on a continuum. Where am I on my journey, and what's my next step? You see the other 2. Sorry, it's a little pixely there. Emerging, tithing, expanding, extravagant, or consistent, obedient, or generous. Or occasional, consistent, obedient, or generous. Making the pathway clear, articulate, helping them self-diagnose where they are is a key piece in the discipleship process. And then we can help, with biblical models, and we can help them find scriptures for each of those that they can step into, because it is discipleship in the same way you want your folks studying the Bible and learning God's word. Jesus did talk a lot about assets and giving and generosity. And so we want to help folks get there as well. So
hey, Ken, real quick there, you probably want to get to it, but I think just when you see those samples, it would be important to note for our friends on the call that those were invented, those terms were kind of come up with by the churches that we work with. So we don't tell people what to do in terms of their discipleship pathway. We guide the discussion, and they decide based on their theology and their kind of vernacular, their vibe. Hey, Greg or Ken or Mike, we want to have 4 levels, or we want to have 3 zones, or we want to call it this, or we want to call it that. So of course, our job is to help them with that, because we want it to feel like them and not like we came in from the outside and said, hey, here are the words you have to use so that you can actually develop generosity. Not at all. It's way collaborative. And it's frankly very interesting to hear what each church decides is the nomenclature they'll attach to this process.
That's a great catch, man. Thanks for catching that. So kind of two places to live right now. I want you guys all on the webinar, just think for a second of the most generous people you know. get a face in mind, get a name in mind. Most generous people, you know. Now I want you to think about some characteristics or attributes, some actions or attitudes that they have. You're probably thinking, man, those folks are joyful, they're unified, they're agile, they're agreeable, they're participating, they're volunteers. I want you to see the big 30,000-foot benefit beyond the dollars of creating a generosity culture is you actually disciple those types of people. And how cool is it to have a church of happy, unified, bought in folks? So just in your own context there, just, write down some descriptions of folks that you know, or actions or attitudes that you'd like to develop. And then to Greg's point, we gave you a couple of examples there, but just begin to think, what might be 4 or 5 levels of growth for generous giver at our church? What might I name them? How might I define those? Just take a second and do that. That would be, a key piece to starting to develop your pathway, your place. And so wave 2, discipleship. Those are 2 key takeaways. Now, next we have strategy. Mike, I'm going to turn to you for this one.
Yeah, great, Kent. I love that discipleship pathway. As I've worked with clients on the discipleship pathway, it's a key tool that if you use over time has tremendous results. When we transition from there to the strategy, we're really thinking about the tactics that go into play of having a comprehensive approach towards developing generous disciples. And that pathway, of course, is a key tool. But the place we want to start is with data. We really need to understand where we are right now. And I think of big data, how many givers do we have? What's the giving per unit? How many new givers do we have? Do we have people giving more or less? What is our age of our giving donor base? I mean, there's a lot of ways that we can explore and understand our data to understand what's happening with our giving in our church. And we also want to think about deep data. Big data tells us the trends, but deep data tells us the story of individuals, someone who stops giving or decreases giving. That might be a pastoral care issue. We have someone who's made the decision to give a first-time gift to the church. I mean, think about what a monumentous occasion that is for someone to start giving monthly. Those are the stories. So we think about big data and deep data. We need to understand that in our church. We need a way to collect that data and interpret it and look at it in ways that's appropriate and helps us create a strategy. From there, we want to think about the developmental tools we have in place. We kind of miss it, but we have the pulpit. We also have offering moments. We have classes. We have seminars. We have annual emphases. There's a lot of tools that we already have in place as churches to receive the tithe. But when we think about what about other areas of generosity, how do we think about cultivating someone who's generous at home or in their business or in their neighborhood? How do we communicate and help build that kind of generosity? And it's the tools. We want to understand the tools we have in place, and then we want to create a plan. We put together the tools that we have, we aim it at our data, and we create a plan where we say, hey, with annual emphasis, we have a quarterly focus on how we bring new people on board, et cetera. We can't go into all depth on this call today, but you want to create a plan that feels really normalized to your people in a way that's going to help them grow and move up that discipleship pathway. We have to put it on a calendar. If you haven't calendared it, you're not going to do it. And so we have to put it all together, the calendar. And then finally, I do want to touch on that final chapter in the strategy section. And this is that whole budgeting section. Just like we talk about theology first, when it comes to strategy, we have to approach the mechanics of integrity. We have to be able to report and celebrate the impact that the receipts that we receive are making in the world and for Christ's kingdom. And that's a key part in helping people be generous, to help them connect the dots with, hey, this is my spiritual act of worship through giving to my church. And here's how it's impacting not just the church, not just the world, but also Christ's kingdom. And so it's essential that we have a budgeting process that reflects our theology, that has integrity, that people feel confident in and trust. And so here's a couple questions that you can take away and apply today. And so first, what does the data tell you about your opportunity for the growth and generosity? So just look at your data, what stories there, where can you focus? And then two, what generous culture building action could you add into your next ministry calendar right now? Just you think about, hey, what's one thing we could do that could help our folks be more generous like Jesus in the next year? Put it in your calendar and track it and look at the data and see how it goes.
Yeah. I just want to say about this, Mike, I love what you just did. And the key to me and what we teach when we're kind of on the road with this material is that we need to shift this to becoming a proactive, and you use the word normalized, part of our culture. Because for so many churches, money talk or generosity talk is almost always reactive. In other words, they're like, oh, crud, we're behind budget. We better talk about money. Or, we need a new this or to fix that, or the roof's leaking or whatever. And it's kind of that, oh, crud moment where, it's a reaction. Whereas if you're continually, strategically, and proactively normalizing just the pattern of how we teach and encourage and thank and all those kinds of things that Kent's about to talk about. But, when it's just part of the normal thing, then it's not like, oh yeah, once a year, just like we tell our kids, you got to eat your vegetables, once a year, I guess we probably ought to talk about money. That's not normalized. That's kind of one-off, just out of obligation to meet a budget. And it's not what we're talking about here. So I love it.
Yeah. It's funny. It makes it more about the money than if you talk about it in a normal way. That's right. If our folks are generous like Jesus, we will have more resources than we need for our vision. It's really amazing what happens when Jesus people really respond to generosity.
Yeah, man, you're going to get me preaching here, but what I say a lot is we unintentionally, and again, I pastored for many years, so I get this. We unintentionally communicate to our people that generosity is about money and meeting budgets. And here's how we do it. We're just trying to be good pastors. And so we say, oh, it's time for the budget talk, or it's time to whatever. Well, what you're communicating is money has to do with budgets. Money has to do with paying bills. Money has to do with keeping the lights on and the staff paid. That doesn't come from scripture. That doesn't come from the life of Jesus. If you had no staff to be paid and no lights to keep on and no roof to fix, I still need to be a generous Jesus person and find ways to demonstrate the grace and love of God. And so again, I think we unintentionally kind of stumble into creating it more to be about money and the transactional component of it than the spiritual and relational component of it. So that's where I get fired up, because I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a shift. By the way, one of my tests is if I came into the pastor and set down $100 million check on the pastor's desk, would he or she say, great, now I never have to talk about money again? And if the answer is that's their temptation or that's the reality, then I would say, then we're not actually understanding what Jesus wants us to understand about this very powerful aspect of our spiritual journey. So, all right, enough preaching. We're going to go along.
Yeah, it's all great. Clearly, we're passionate about this. The communication piece. Reason we're showing you the book title or book chapter titles is just the book itself is again a playbook. It's a field guide, and it's pretty robust. It kind of helps you walk through all these things. Communication, there's a lot in here. Where are the gaps of our communication? How do we close those gaps? We're talking about a generosity culture or developing that culture, but a capital campaign is a part, for instance, of cultivating culture. Let's not make those just simply transactional or project based. Let's lean into those and say, look, we're cultivating, in this particular case, for a project, but we're cultivating generosity. And then ultimately, we want to measure impact of generosity, and we want to talk about those contribution statements and impact reporting. This is where I see churches really, really struggle, is in the reporting and celebrating. So we're good to ask. Usually we're asking out of desperation, but we're not good at celebrating consistently of the return on investment. And just for your reference point, your generosity in your church is going to ride on the back of three things. Number one, relationship. Do I trust the leader? Do I trust the person who's talking to me? Relationally, am I connected? Do I hear what they're saying? Opportunity is the second thing. Is there a real opportunity for impact, or are they just asking for something frivolous? And then ultimately vision, which is the main thing that makes the opportunity a worthwhile investment. And so those three things are where your communication need to reside. Is it relational? Does it have good opportunity? And is it couched in vision? Reporting on that is really, really important. End of year, throughout the year, quarterly, how do we tell the story of impact? People are investing in kingdom cause for return on that investment. The return in this case is not a dollar amount. Return on this in this case is impact. And so how do you tell that story? Now, Greg and I have talked at length about this, and we were even laughing about this morning. All of us have capacity to celebrate and report. Sometimes we just don't have time, don't have margin, or maybe we don't have confidence. And so churches are really bad. We tend to communicate or celebrate either orally or in text or spreadsheets. And that's pretty uninspiring. So I gave you a couple of examples here of a couple of churches who really have it down, and they're telling their ROI story visually. They're telling it in bite-sized chunks. And so this is a one-pager they can hand out, place in a worship folder, worship bulletin, and hand out. If you guys, this is just if you're interested, there's a strategic partner we have called the Impact Report Company. If this is not something you have margin for or competency in-house for to create the graphic report, this is a kind of a mom and pop shop, and they can help you and do it really well. Here are two examples of those. So when you think about your communication, here's a kind of a funny first question to ask is, hey, find someone under 30 and ask them to evaluate how well we're doing in our digital giving approach. So the digital piece is something we don't think about a lot, and it's where the whole world is shifting. But if you're my age, you're probably not going to speak into it with much competency. So ask someone under 30. My daughter's 23. She works for a marketing company. She has a lot to say. And so you might want to just ask somebody under 30 in your congregation. And then here's a real practical eval right now, just a diagnosis. Do a quick inventory and count the times that you've done a thank you for your generosity as an intentional part of your process or your worship recently. How often recently have you simply said thank you? That is pretty low-hanging fruit, and it's a key piece of communication and developing a culture. So those are two kind of key takeaways on communication that I'd offer to you.
So Kent, I love that.
Yeah,
I love the thank you. I worked with a pastor a few years ago that didn't feel comfortable with the thank you. He felt like, hey, people should do this because of their disciples of Jesus. They don't need to we don't need to thank them. And I just reminded him, let's look at the New Testament. Let's look at Paul's letters. Let's look at the book of Philippians. Paul says, hey, thank you for your gift. And so this is just, hey, I'm appreciative that I get to be in partnership with people who are awesome and who are in mission with me. And just like, it's just a normal part of good, healthy human relationships for us to be appreciative to one another. There's a Christ likeness about that. And so it's just really important for us to remember this is a biblical part of us being stewards of the people that God has sent to partner with us on mission. I love that.
That's a great word. Hey, everybody on the webinar, just as a reminder, we're going to do some Q&A at the end. If you have a question of anything that we've talked about, and I know we're kind of processing through it quickly, if you have any kind of questions around anything we're talking about, post them in that chat box so we can get to them here at the end.
And Ken, I'd say even if they've got a question because they thought they were going to hear something on this webinar about generosity and we're not talking about it, it doesn't have to be about what we're talking about right now. Yeah. We love this conversation. So if you think it's a wild hair kind of out of left field question, ask it. We love it.
Well, in that vein, just keep going. So Greg, we're wave 5 integration. What does that mean?
Yeah. Integration is a big word for Auxano, and here's why. You can get sort of lost in la la land with concepts and with ideas and with meetings and whiteboards. But if you do not put the boots on the ground, it's all for naught. So integration in our world in our world of vision clarity, when we help churches organize their structure for disciple making, in every other aspect of what we do, we always say, hey, how do we integrate it? How do we get it into the water? How do we get it normalized, as Mike said? How do you get it into the flow of how people talk and interact with one another in their church? So this was a fun one, because in this wave, I actually explored and then wrote about generational differences. For instance, you all know that people look at money based on their age and stage in life and based on their generation, right? So that when a pastor says something, or a small group leader, or whatever you want to say, a leader in a church says something about generosity, it's often being heard by 4 or 5 generations of human beings, all of whom will hear the word money, and it'll trip triggers that are different in their brain than the other guy sitting next to them. So for me, that was an interesting and exciting exploration. And I think as church leaders, we're going to have to stay on this one. This is a big deal. This is a very frequent question we get, just like Kent started off with the aging donor base problem. So the question we always get is, okay, what are we going to do about it? How do we, quote unquote, reach the younger donor? And that's why we have tools in there like, well, you better ask them first, like get in there and ask them. So generational differences, a big section for us too is leadership accountability. How can you expect to have a culture of generosity if not just the pastor, but people leading worship, leading small groups, leading Sunday school, leading the parking lot team? If people have influence over other people, that means that they are part of the flow of what's happening in your church. And if you're not discussing the possibility or the likelihood that you should hold leaders accountable, we think that's a critical category. Then, of course, some help and tips in there about discipling wealthy folks. Am I allowed to do that? Is that biblical? What do we do with the book of James, et cetera? And so that's a fun discussion there too. By the way, before we go to the tips there, Kent, chapter 31, that's the payoff, baby. Generosity Discipleship Plan. And here's what this is. The GDP, Generosity Discipleship Plan, is a custom plan that your church develops based on this material that literally has written out everything that we've talked about in the waves, right? We want you to write out, what is your theology of generosity? We want you to write out, what is your discipleship pathway? What are you going to call your 4 levels? What names are going to be part of your, Number 3, we want you to write out, what's your strategy? We want you to write out your communication plan, how often, at what pace, what kind of media, et cetera. And then also the rest of these things about how do we want to interact with leaders, different generations, wealthy folks, et cetera. So the GDP is the payoff of this process, because what it does is it gives you a 12-year proactive plan for creating a culture of generosity so that you don't have to have those oh crud moments, right? So that you already have a plan in place that you then execute and evaluate. You integrate it. That's why this is called integration. Let's get it boots on the ground so that we can find out what works and what we need to adjust. Here's some tips. Discuss with your leadership team how many generations are in your church and how each could view giving and generosity. I love this discussion. Number one, it's kind of interesting, but way more than interesting, it is part of good leadership in the modern context, which is, of course, we're not reaching a lot of the younger people. We don't know how to speak their language. Believe me, I have 20-something adult children who remind me often that I don't know how to speak their language. And then number 2, what would an increase in the culture of generosity mean for your church's mission beyond just paying the bills? This is the dream, right? The dream is that everything goes in a good direction. People's devotion to Christ, their giving both to your church and other causes of Christ, that your church has more fuel for the fire. And so this is one of those sort of begin with the end in mind kind of exercises where if you've got a bunch of leaders together and say, hey, what would we do or what could God do through us if our current budget went up 30%? People are like, Greg, come on. Are you just trying to exaggerate there and get us to buy your book? No. We have some churches way before I ever wrote this book, Mike Gammill on this call, Kent Vincent on this call. These guys have led churches through this process. I just put it down on paper, but they've led churches through this process that have seen 15, 20, 25, 30% increases in giving. But it's way more than that. It's that people are leaning forward. They're engaged with the mission of the church. They're kind of, they woke up in a way, because again, we think this is one of the critical issues of the spiritual and relational life of my connection with my church. And so do the dream discussion too. What would happen in and through our church if we bumped by 10, 20, 30% in terms of fuel for our mission?
Yeah, so we're going to hop into some frequently asked questions, and then we're going to take your Q&A. To Greg's point, the churches that have actually developed their plan and are actually working their plan are seeing amazing return. Not only in dollars, but they're seeing, if we go back to that idea of, hey, talk to me about characteristics and attributes of generous people, they're seeing that come to fruition in their body. This week, I spoke to 3 different pastors who I've worked with. The most frequent one the most recent one was 3 years ago. All of these pastors are seeing between 16 and 23% evergreen increase in income. That's a big, big deal. And so they were serious about it. They actually built the plan. They've actually implemented the plan, and their communication, all the ways we're talking about, are robust and built into their culture. And so they're doing great. So frequently asked questions. The first one we get a lot is cost. So you can use the book, and you can do it yourself. A lot of times, this is what we do. And so we're always asked, hey, can you present a proposal? And then, can we afford it? And here's what I tell them. Look, we are seeing consistently an increase of 10 to 30% in churches. It's evergreen, 10 to 30% increase. We're more than paying for our cost. So if you are even considering this and you feel like you need a coach, you feel like you need a consultant, let's have a conversation. But the cost is not going to be the issue, because we are going to more than make up for the cost in the discipleship of generosity that's going to pay dividends in your church for years and years and years and years. And at the end of the day, we are a nonprofit entity. And the way we tell potential clients all the time, like you, is, look, we're not going to if you believe we're the right partner for you, we're going to not let cost stand in the way. And so let's have a conversation. So frequently asked question is cost. Can we afford it? Another one is timelines. What if we need the money now? What if we need the money now? So would one of you guys like to speak on that?
Yeah, let me jump in on that, Ken. I mean, I think part of it is, people are like, well, we want increased giving. And actually it's because we have a situation, and I get that. We get that. We've all pastored. We know the drill. What we're trying to do is kind of ride this fine line between making it sort of a quick hit sort of money grab because we need some money and doing this evergreen kind of thing that we keep talking about, meaning we want to put in place structure that enables a strong house of generosity. We don't want to just sort of paint the front door and say, look, let's just keep trucking. So this is what I'd say about what if we need money now. Number one, we have found, and it's hard to prove this sort of with science or data, but instinctively we know that as soon as we start talking about generosity in a formal way,
Yep.
meaning like behind the scenes,
Yep.
just with church leadership, we start doing some of our surveys and some of the things that sort of kind of start to rumble in the church, generosity goes up even before we quote unquote finish the process. Even before we've inked the generosity discipleship plan, something happens in the energy of the church where it starts to go up. And so I would say you will see increases even before we finish. When we finish, you'll see them in a more formal and architectural way that stays in the foundation of the church going forward. So yeah, we can get a quick hit, but at what cost? I don't want your people to think that we're coming after them. I want them to think that we care about their spiritual life and the life of the church in the long run.
Then a third one we see quite a bit is buy-in. Like, how do I convince my board or elders or whoever is leading with me? How do I convince those? Mike, you mind stepping in and answering this one for us?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think about Jesus' parable of the talents when I think about our congregation. I feel like that as pastors, we steward a congregation of folks, and each one of them are kind of like the talents that Jesus led in the parable. And The question is, what do we do with them? How do we guide and direct and develop the energy that God's given in our congregation? And that potential within our congregation is really released through their generosity, not just towards our church, but also out in the community. So when I think about talking to the board and our leaders about the generosity process, the first thing we have to do with buy-in is really go to that cost side and say, hey, Jesus has given us all of these folks to steward. How can we release that? One of the best ways to do that is to really help our folks be more generous, not just financially into our church. Yes, absolutely, but also in their lives, in their homes, in their neighborhoods, in their businesses, as generous Jesus followers. And so helping the board realize that this is a multiplier. This is a multiplying process that multiplies the effect that we already have. This is about discipleship, and this is about ongoing giving. We use that phrase, evergreen. This is giving that's going to the budget to increase our impact in the church, in our community, in the world. As a little different than a project where we're building a facility or accomplishing a thing. That's its own place. That's its own conversation. This is about that ongoing giving. And as far as buy-in, so the financial multiplier, it's about discipleship, it's about ongoing giving. And then I'd say if you engage us, we will always be open to this conversation of how to talk to your board specifically in your context and the nuances that you have there with your team.
That's great. So a couple of Q&As here as we wrap up. And guys, I don't know if you're following looking at the chat box, but we've just as a celebration and a thank you, we've got an international audience here. We've got UK,
Oh, cool.
We've got Canada, we got France. That's amazing. Tim, thanks for your kind words. Greg, I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, thanks, Tim.
Tim
really
gave you
cool.
a shout out. Ed, thank you for your kind words. And there's part of me that's like, hey, let's get you and Mikey talking here. But Ed, thanks for your comments on there. John asked a question. He says, a lot of churches appear to use the metaphorical image of generosity ladder to communicate the stages of growth. The examples I shared with you, that was not included on that. Any thoughts on the church of the choice of metaphors for visually communicating generosity? Greg, Mike, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I got it. I mean, I think that's first of all, generosity ladder, Nelson Searcy, that stuff. Really, we're standing on the shoulders of guys like that, and so we're doing a lot of the same thing as that. And what we showed you was some quick images, but we are totally into using imagery, metaphor, icons, anything that can allow people to grab onto the kind of the self-evaluation of where am I currently in my spiritual formation around generosity, and what would it mean for me to take a next step? I'll often run a next step campaign, and a campaign is a weird word, but you know what I mean, an initiative where we literally teach the 4 or 5 zones using metaphors and icons and imagery and media. And we'll actually ask the church folks anonymously to identify, where are you at? Where are you at on the generosity ladder? Or where are you at in our steps of becoming a mature and generous disciple? So number one, we do a self-evaluation survey with that sort of metaphorical language. And then secondly, we ask them, would you prayerfully consider taking your next step? Again, either on the ladder, in the clouds, and we use arrows and boxes and circles and whatever we got to do. But that's again where you invent it with us. We're going to be tapping into the gifting of your folks and your media people and your artists who can communicate things so beautifully, other than just, again, we're trying to get away from Excel sheets and bar graphs and pie charts. We love that stuff. We can kind of nerd out on it, but that's not how the average person understands, sort of the spiritual journey around money.
I think one of the keys with those images, Greg, is that we want the image to reflect our unique theology. And of course, our theology, all of it lives within scripture, but all of us have just a little different approach, and we answer some key questions a little differently. So we want that image to really convey the uniqueness of where we are. So for one church, a ladder might feel a little too transactional or a little too much about a dollar amount.
That's right.
Whereas another image can really convey what's unique in your system about how you want people to think about generosity development.
Well, folks, for all of you who joined us, a great big thanks. We want to talk to you. So if you want to find more about us, we're going to be following up with you with some follow-up emails, but you can just simply go to auxano.com/generosity-campaigns. That gives you all the information about us. You can find us there as well. Don't hesitate to reach out if it's an inquiry or just a question. Please don't hesitate to reach out. We want to help you create a culture, cultivate a culture where you have generous people who are crazy generous for kingdom cause. So thank you guys for joining us. It's been a blessing to be with you. You guys have a great rest of the week, great weekend, and we look forward to talking to you soon. God bless.
Thanks, y'all. See you later.
Thank you, everybody.